Once upon a time, in the middle of the desert, there was a city that never slept. The action was hot, and it dealt out drama in spades. This weekend, expect the drag to be low, but the speeds to be high. Who will roll the dice and take a gamble? Who'll be winners and who'll be losers? Either way, all bets are off, because this is Vegas, baby. Yeah, that's right. Formula One is back on the streets of Nevada's biggest city. And when it comes to technical developments, let's take a look at who's decided to stick and who has decided to twist. Coming up, we take a look at how the teams are preparing for the specific challenges of Sin City. The teams have already shown their hands with a range of new floors, but with the FIA making some changes, is it a case of the house always wins? And finally, what happens in Vegas doesn't always stay in Vegas. Who's looking towards the future? I've been a little bit surprised coming into this race weekend with the sheer amount of performance-related upgrades on the cars visible up and down the pit lane. In fact, only one team, Williams, who smashed their cars to pieces in Brazil, do not have any upgrades at all on their car. Everybody else has at least something, and some teams have bought some pretty major bits and bobs. And that's a big surprise at this stage of the season, with only 3 races left on the calendar, including this weekend. And you don't normally expect to see big changes, but some of the changes are really quite significant. Take a look at Ferrari, for example. They've introduced a new floor for this race weekend. In fact, they brought 2 different versions of the floor to Las Vegas, and you can see the difference quite clearly when you look at this cutout at the rear. On the old specification floor, the linkage and this link section between the forward section and the rear section is completely different. But that's only telling half the story, or even a third of the story, because this whole side piece of the floors, the 2 different versions they've got in Las Vegas, are completely different. And that's just a hint as to what's going on underneath the floor, where all the real magic happens and the team don't let us look. And I think that's a big, bold step from Ferrari, who are making a real bid to win the Constructors' Championship, beating off the attentions of McLaren and slightly less of a threat these days, Red Bull. But Ferrari really going for the championship, and it looks like that fight's going to go down to the wire. And we'll be taking a look at a bit more at how those competitors have developed through the season a little bit later on. But moving on, Haas has bought a new floor. Even Red Bull fighting for everything they can get, making sure Max Verstappen can win the championship over Lando Norris. They've changed the leading edge of some of the portions of their floor as well. So lots of detail work going on the floors up and down the pit lane. And these are not Vegas-specific upgrades. These are upgrades that they want to take through to the end of the season and the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. So the fighting in the engineering offices is going all the way down to the wire this season, and that shows how close the Constructors' Championship fights are, and to a lesser extent, the Drivers' Championship. But when you get down to it, actually, there's been a little bit of a curveball thrown into the mix. All of these teams prepared their new floors weeks in advance. You can't just make a new floor in a few days. It's one of the largest components on the car, and it takes many, many weeks to design, build, and actually get those floors out to the racetrack and fitted to the car. It's a big, big job. And the FIA have made everybody's job a little bit harder by introducing a new technical directive coming into this Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend. And it relates to this part of the car. You can just see it sticking out here on the leading edge of the Alpine. It's the so-called wooden plank, which Craig Scarborough will point out at great effort. It's not actually made of wood anymore. But this is the plank mounted underneath the car. It's about 10 millimeters thick, and you're only allowed to wear 1 millimeter off it over the course of a Grand Prix distance. Now, we did see teams get caught out by that at the US Grand Prix at Austin last season, but so far this season, nobody's really been caught out by that. However, the FIA had introduced a little bit of wiggle room in the regulations to allow the teams to use some metal inserts around different parts of the floor. And in that regulation, it seems that it may have been a little bit of an omission in the wording, in that the thickness of these metal inserts wasn't properly regulated. Well, the FIA have closed down that loophole with these new regulations, but it's introduced this technical directive just before the Las Vegas Grand Prix. And some teams, if you listen to some of the paddock rumours at least, haven't really had the time to react. And the only way they can make sure their cars and their floors don't wear out excessively in these final 3 races is to raise the ride height of the car ever so slightly. And that could cost a huge amount of performance. So the FIA have really thrown a curveball in just before the end of the season. It's going to be really interesting to see how the different teams are going to manage this and if anybody's performance goes up or down noticeably as a result of this. I don't think we're really going to hear the full story of this for some time yet. But Las Vegas itself has its own very specific challenges, and you can see that particularly when you look at the rear of the V-carb. I am, of course, talking about the sparkly paintwork on the car. This actually has more of a technical interest than you may realise. Las Vegas is a big marketing race for all of the team, and there is pressure on the teams to bring different paint jobs, different marketing promotions onto the cars. V-carb have gone all sparkly for it. Now that sparkly livery is going to have a weight implication for the car, and weight on this generation of cars is absolutely on the limit. Don't forget, at the beginning of this season, Alpine could barely paint their car at all and had to take off little tiny stickers to save a few grams here or there. Well, Alpine have gone full Las Vegas as well, with their pink livery returning, a heavier livery than they started the season with, but they've saved a huge amount of weight on their car as well. Let's not forget, Red Bull decided not to run their special promotional livery earlier this season because they were worried about the weight. Clearly, V-carb, they've saved a bit of weight on their car and they've gone all sparkly for it. Of course, I am teasing a little bit because what I really wanted to show you was the cooling exit at the rear end of the V-carb. Now, the cooling exit at the back of the V-carb is extremely tight, and that's probably not a great surprise when you look at the weather forecast for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. It's the coldest Grand Prix since the 1970s, with single figures Celsius temperatures, and that is going to have a bit of an effect on the cars. To find out a little bit more about that, staying with V-carb, let's hear from Alan Permain.
Tyre temperatures are going to be a focus of us and I'm sure our competitors throughout the weekend, and certainly today we've got a lot of work planned on making sure we've got tyre temperatures for the start of the lap with qualifying in mind, but also over a long run, making sure the tyres are at their optimum for when we've got high fuel in the car.
Those cool temperatures do have a big effect on the cars, but it's maybe not quite what a lot of people think about. Now, I mentioned the cooling packages earlier, and I was again teasing slightly. Now, here's the rear bodywork of the V-carb in the garage from earlier today, and you can see the shape of the car has been revised significantly. New engine cover on the back of the car. But have a look at this. No cooling louvres in the centre line, on the edges of the car. This is quite a closed-up car. And actually, that's all to do with drag reduction. If you compare it to the layout of the bodywork that the team used at the Mexican Grand Prix, look at the size of the louvres. Slightly asymmetric layout here, but you can see they've got the capacity to change it. But look at the width of the engine cover, just to expel as much air from out of that bodywork in the high altitude in Mexico City, where you don't have that dense air going through. But this is actually nothing to do with the ambient temperature particularly, because when you've got components under that bodywork of about 1,000 degrees centigrade, changing the ambient temperature by 20 degrees or so isn't going to make the biggest difference. It does make a difference, but it's not a massive difference. The big factor at this racetrack compared to, say, Mexico, where you've got the high altitude, that is a big factor, but the biggest factor at the Las Vegas Grand Prix is the very, very high average speed. It's all straights and slow speed corners, but the cars are whizzing down the straights at speeds exceeding 360 kph, and that means an increased mass flow going through that bodywork for a smaller aperture. So you can get basically as much cooling as you'd get, say, at Monaco from a much smaller aperture. So you don't need all of those cooling louvres. You can shut everything up and close up that bodywork to keep it slippery, to keep the average speed high and reduce the drag. However, you've probably already heard about the cool temperatures having an effect on the tyres. Well, you can't just crank on downforce to improve that tyre temperature, because if you do, the aerodynamic drag from cranking on the downforce is going to absolutely kill you going down the straights. So the teams have got this fine balance between generating tyre temperature and reducing drag. And you can see a lot of that on the front wings of different cars. Ferrari have modified their upper element of the front wing to reduce drag to the right degree. McLaren have bought a number of different options. We've seen this cut-out McLaren wing trialled by the team before, but they've not actually raced. They further revised it on this outer element where those wing elements join the end plate. They're hoping to save a bit of drag. We'll have to wait and see which version of the wing they use, because they have other options at the track. This version, the bigger wing, the bigger upper element, this will generate more front tyre temperature. It's more front downforce, but it will also generate more drag, and that will hurt them going down the straight, and it'll make them easy pickings for a faster car on the straight. So you've got to look out for that. But not all of the developments on these cars are Las Vegas specific. Some teams have bought, as I mentioned earlier, pure performance upgrades. And looking at the rear end of the V-Carb, they've introduced a completely new rear suspension arrangement. And that's got a lot more to do with developing the car's performance for the rest of this year, and I think into next year as well. And that, why do I say next year? Because we've got a stable rule set going into the 2025 season. And that means teams can put development on the cars for this year, and they have that, the value of that development goes all the way through into next year's car. And don't forget, teams cannot do any work on the 2026 cars until the 1st of January. They've got to wait till New Year's Day before they can do anything. So to explain a little bit more about the changes to the rear end of the V-Carb and why they've been made, let's talk to Alan Permain once again.
We've got some aerodynamic updates around the rear of the car. We've got a new rear suspension geometry, which is both aerodynamic and mechanical change. And coupled with that, we've got some changes to the furniture around the rear brake ducts and the bodywork where it interacts with that rear suspension, all designed to give us some more downforce. The 25 car will very much be a development of this car. It will use the same gearbox as this car. I think it'll start the season with the same rear suspension, so definitely anything we're adding in that area now will be applicable to the start of next season.
So that's fascinating stuff from Alan Permain there. Clearly V-Carb trying to save a little bit of work for themselves, and actually by saving that work for themselves by not putting a huge amount of new conceptual work into next year's car, that's all effort that from the 1st of January can go into their 2026 design. However, some teams are going to have to face a really big trade-off. V-Carb have clearly identified where they want to be. But if you're, say, McLaren, if you're Red Bull, if you're Ferrari, or if you're Mercedes, you've got to think about, do you want to go for the championship in 2025, which will come at the expense of losing out on aerodynamic development time for the 2026 car? Or do you do what Sauber clearly have done? They're going to be dead last in the points. They haven't got a point on the board this season. They're pretty much certain to be last in the Constructors' Championship. But when that team morphs into Audi for the start of the 2026 season, that new Audi for the start of 2026 will have the highest amount of aerodynamic development conducted on it compared to every other team. So it would make sense, say, for Sauber to write off the entire 2025 season and go into 2026 with maximum effort. By doing that, you're losing performance in one year, but trading it off again for the next year. It's the big gamble, and some of those decisions on how to roll the dice are being taken where else than in Las Vegas.